Dr. Pinn is Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University. He's also Research Director at the Institute for Humanist Studies. He's an author of numerous books, and I have his picture on the next slide. And one of his latest books is Writing God's Obituary, How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist. After his talk, he would like you guys to ask as many questions as you like.
Good morning. Good morning. You can probably do a little better than that. You know, I traveled all the way from Texas, and you can...
Good morning.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be with you today. What I'd like to do is just, there are a few things I'd like to say, but I'd like to spend most of our time in conversation, if that's okay. It wasn't a real question, that's what we were going to do anyway, but I'm trying to be polite, right? Trying to be polite. So there are a few things I'd like to say, and then we'll open it up and we'll chat for a bit, yeah? So let me begin with a little context. It's important to recognize that I've spent my life kind of evenly split between church involvement and humanist, atheist thought and activity. I turned 50 this year, and my life is fairly evenly split between those two. The first 25 years of my life, heavily involved in the church. From the age of 12 to roughly 25, I was involved in church ministry. I was a minister preaching. I was a youth pastor at a rather prominent church in New York, and Brooklyn, New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant. The church is about 4,000 members, and I was the youth pastor. I was deeply involved, deeply committed to Christian ministry. But it reached a point for me where it was clear that theism wasn't offering, at least theism as I understood it and studied it, wasn't offering a felt difference in the world. It required a compromise with human suffering and misery, a compromise with those. Within the context of the Christian church, this is intrinsic to the very tradition. It centers around the Christ event. This is a compromise with human suffering, that what is best about the universe comes to us only through pain and misery. It wasn't making a felt difference. I was working with young people who had an easier time plotting out their deaths and writing their eulogies than they did thinking about a bright and productive future. And I had little to say that made a difference. So I had to make a decision. What was most important to me? Helping to improve quality of life or maintaining a tradition? And I decided what was most important to me was protecting, safeguarding, and doing what I could to improve quality of life. And for me, this stemmed back to something my grandmother told me as she sent me off to school. She said, "Tony, move through the world knowing your footsteps matter." This was my grandmother's way of saying you don't get to live for just you. That you move through the world recognizing that both in active and passive ways, your approach to life has consequences. You've got to be sensitive to those consequences and work as best you can to make certain that those consequences are as positive as they could be. So I contacted the minister at the church and said I wouldn't be participating anymore. I just couldn't do it. I contacted my bishop. I was a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, oldest black denomination in the country. I contacted my bishop and said, I'm surrendering ordination. I just can't be involved anymore. I was willing to be a lot of things, but I was not going to be a hypocrite. And the idea of being in the pulpit, preaching what I did not believe, I could not do. Right? It couldn't be about a paycheck. It had to involve more than that. So I left. But I had nowhere to go. I knew what I wasn't. At that point, I'm defining life in terms of negation. I know what I'm not. I'm not a Christian. Hell, by and large, it extends beyond that. I'm not a theist. There's just us. Love it or hate it, just us. But I had no positive examples, right? I'm doing this by negation. I know what I'm not, but I had a difficult time determining what I was. Now, I was still interested in religion because it's a cultural force that has impact, and I needed to understand it. So I continued to study religion, but I understood now that I was no longer in ministry, it was fine to simply have good questions. I could be in the classroom and have good questions and not worry about the answers, because my obligation was to nurture and encourage critical thinking skills, to help these students develop good questions that would push for even better questions, to probe, to dismantle, to deconstruct in order to make a difference. And that made sense to me. So I continued to study religion, but I wasn't quite certain how to name myself. I encountered folks from a variety of communities. I was in Minnesota with my first job, and I encountered members of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and I encountered some of them as a graduate student at Harvard, but I wasn't particularly impressed. And I wasn't impressed in large part because they had no theology, as far as I could tell, that there was a general openness to any and everything that made it difficult to define an experience that was unique. That my encounters with them kind of involved Christianity light, the ritual structures without the content. Now, I'm a UU now, right? I'm a member of the UU Association, so I say this from the inside, just kind of lacked theological substance. So, and it wasn't clear to me they did race well. It wasn't clear to me they did race well. They were quick to tell me about their involvements, but it wasn't clear to me they did race well. So I wasn't going to call myself a UU, not at that stage. I hadn't encountered very many humanists or atheists, so I was just at a loss. I was just Tony, trying to do what I could, move through the world as best I could. Now, unlike some, I didn't lose family and friends as a result of this stance, but it didn't matter to me that I had to have integrity. And if I lost folks as a consequence, okay, but I didn't. My mother, who had entered ministry after me, sat me down and said, look, we disagree, and I'm believing God will bring you back. But until then, you're my blood, and I'll always love you. My extended family just said, well, this is Tony, you know. That's just him. Other friends said, you know, the problem is he went to that school. He went to the school and they know nothing about Jesus, and he lost his yearning. He lost his burning for the faith, but God will bring him back. Some folks, assuming they were being kind, would say things like this to me, and I'm being real. This is what they would say. I just hope something happens to you. Just something happens to you so that God can bring you back. Now, these are people who supposedly at least like me, if not love me. I just hope something happens to you so God can bring you back. But I'm struggling, trying to find a way. And I finally encountered some humanists and atheists who looked like you. And everything revolved around the Enlightenment. Right, and the Renaissance. And for me, this was problematic because the Enlightenment has an underbelly that isn't so pleasant to folks who look like me. Right, keep in mind what the Renaissance and the Enlightenment make possible, a kind of deep philosophical basis for racial disregard. Right, a deep philosophical and scientific basis for racial disregard. But the humanists and atheists I encountered did not recognize this, and that troubled me. They talked about the Enlightenment without talking about enslavement. They pushed to the context of North America, and they talked about Thomas Jefferson. Yay, Thomas Jefferson. They talked about Thomas Jefferson without talking about his passive endorsement of slavery. This is the man who says, we do this, but no more because it's going to mess up Virginia and it's going to mess up the country. And for my mind, as soon as Thomas Jefferson was embraced and celebrated, there was a link between free thought skepticism, however you want to name it, a link between that and discrimination that wasn't wrestled with. And this was a problem for me. So I was a researcher, and as a researcher, I knew how to find information. And so I needed to find a different way of thinking about humanism and atheism, a way that raised critical questions concerning some of our assumptions, and that brought into the fore folks who looked like me. And so very early on, I determined I wasn't going to talk about race anymore. And by that, I meant I wasn't going to talk about race as a problem. I was not going to talk about race or difference as a problem to solve, but I was going to talk about race and difference as a promise, as a benefit we live into. And so this became my way of thinking. White humanists and atheists in the context of the United States owe people who look like me a debt of gratitude, because we've given you a way to think about reason, to think about critiques of metaphysics and supernaturalism, and still hold in check isms like racism. Let me give you an example. You're probably all familiar with the spirituals, yeah? Okay, you're familiar with the spirituals. Well, we can't accurately date the spirituals. Scholars like John Lovett argue that as soon as enslaved Africans step off the boats, the spirituals begin to generate. Yeah? We can't accurately date the spirituals, but it's also true we cannot accurately date the counterpoint. Secular songs, cornfield ditties, things that we've come to call the blues. Now, don't think in terms of race records. We're talking about orderly formulations that run contrary to the spirituals. In fact, these early formulations, these secular tunes, critique, signify, and belittle the theological assumptions that you find in the spirituals. We've given you, from early on, a way of critiquing and dismantling theistic theological sensibilities, and doing that in a way that is deeply historical, empirical, and embodied. You should say thank you to us for this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. In addition to that, in addition to the ways in which this musical form has allowed for a very different way of thinking about metaphysics, a very different way of thinking about superstition, and doing it in a way that undercuts and dismantles theistic sensibilities, beyond this musical form, literature begins to develop very early that raises these sorts of questions. I'll give you an example. There was a famous minister, Daniel Alexander Payne, a mainstay within the growing African Methodist Episcopal Church, and I'm skipping around historically, yeah? Because I'm a theologian, not a historian, so I get to skip around. Daniel Alexander Payne argues that it's disbelief within black communities that is the best argument for the end of slavery. Disbelief in black communities, from his perspective, is the best rationale for dismantling slavery. And he says he knows this personally, that he does a lot of traveling in the South. And he says it's his custom when he runs across someone to have a conversation with them and ask about the condition of their soul. Are you a Christian? He encounters a young African-American male and he asks this question, and the young man says, no, I'm not a Christian. And Daniel Alexander Payne is a bit thrown. And he probes a little further, and this young man says, well, based upon what the Christian faith has done within the context of life here, how can I be? I can't be. Daniel Alexander Payne probes a little more and walks away with this understanding that within the context of black life, the brutality of slavery has created a population that not only raises questions concerning the utility of the church, but raises questions concerning the very existence of God. And from his perspective, again, this was grounds for dismantling slavery. That you could not have theism and have this sort of servitude. Did not work. Frederick Douglass provides another way of thinking about this, and we tend to think about Frederick Douglass and kind of passively lump him with church figures. But if, in fact, he were a church figure, Sojourner Truth probably wouldn't have asked him, Fred, is God dead? Because Frederick Douglass talked about human progress. He talked about the advancement of a despised population and talked about the strength of our own bodies, our ability to get things done. And she asked, Fred, is God dead? Frederick Douglass understood the pragmatic value of religion. But personal engagement, no. Think about his autobiography. If you're familiar with it, think back to his fight with the overseer, Covey, in the barn. Are you familiar with this? Yeah. Well, in this barn, up to this point, Frederick Douglass argues that he's being dismantled, right? That this overseer is breaking him, and he's reaching a point where he's beginning to understand himself as not only a slave in form, but a slave in being, right? Ontologically, that is, at his very core, who he is, his very essence, is slave. This is what Covey is doing to him. But he reaches a point where the beatings are too much. Covey has him in the barn. And Frederick Douglass decides to fight back. They go toe-to-toe. And Frederick Douglass holds his own. And after that fight, Frederick Douglass discovers himself anew. It's not the conjure that works on his behalf. It's not the church that works on behalf. It's his ability as an embodied being to fight for his own dignity and integrity that gives him a different type of lucidity, a different type of awareness of life. And at that point, he recognizes that he's a slave in form only. He doesn't attribute this to any kind of supernatural forces. It's not metaphysical. It's not that God prompts him to do something. It's his own desire to maintain the integrity of his existence. That matters to him. And it seems to me this is coded in his language. Now, my colleagues will argue, no, Pinn, you're all wrong about this because Frederick Douglass provides an apology for the church in the final autobiography. Yeah, but take a look at this. Frederick Douglass says, look, you know, you got to understand that what I'm critiquing here is the Christianity of the slaveholder, right? The Christianity that allows rape and then church service, that allows physical abuse and economic gain on the back of enslaved Africans and then positions of church authority. He says this is the kind that I'm suspicious of, but he says the Christianity that is about uplift, that is about renewal. This is what is okay with him. So here's the question. Did this type of Christianity he's interested in exist? It didn't exist. Not in a context for which he was, not a context he was familiar with, not a context that he knew. He was in favor of a kind of Christianity that could not exist. He's in favor of a certain ethical and moral platform that cannot be developed based upon the workings of that faith. Let me give you another example. And again, we're jumping historically. Think in terms of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Christians, black and white, claim him because he wrote about churches. I write about churches, but they don't claim me. He wrote about churches. He wrote about religiosity. He does this as an early figure in the development of sociology, right? He does this, but W.E.B. Du Bois argues if they would just read him, rather than read at him, read him, he's quite clear on this. He argues growing up in Great Barrington, his family not all that deep into Christianity, not all that deep into the church, and that it really never had a hold on him. And he argues once he's working on a PhD and he goes to Germany, any attention to metaphysics, superstition, theism goes away. It just goes away. So he studies the black church as a cultural development without any personal allegiance to that faith. But we've allowed the Christians to claim him. But you ought to thank us for W.E.B. Du Bois, who provides a way to think about. So he provides a way to do something that we don't typically do all that well. He's able to interrogate, deconstruct, and analyze religion without venom and disregard. Yeah, he unpacks it and explores it in a way that recognizes what it has done, right? A kind of complex depiction of it. Something that we typically have a difficult time doing. For him, it's a cultural development that warrants some attention, right? A kind of complex layered and balanced presentation. He teaches us how to do this. Reread him. Put him on your summer reading list. You'll email me and thank me. Let's push forward. There's a period in time that we've come to reference as the Harlem Renaissance, right? We're talking about roughly the 20s, kind of moving forward as far as the 50s. Then you get into kind of black realism. But this Harlem Renaissance is concerned with rethinking the narrative of black life, the story of black life. And the argument for these writers, and we talk in terms of Harlem Renaissance, but it really goes as deep as DC, right? Their argument is, look, folks like Frederick Douglass, wonderful. The narrative, wonderful. But it does us a disservice because it assumes that the white standard of life, the white standard of relationships has to be maintained, right? So Frederick Douglass is trying to fit black life into a white paradigm in order to say, look, you should value us because we're like you. So there are ways in which, for these writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Frederick Douglass and folks like him sanitize black life, lose some of its humanity, its depth, its complexity, for kind of limited task. This limited task being fit us within the status quo, and white folks will love us, at least respect us, maybe not beat on us. Harlem Renaissance writers say, no, this is the wrong way to do it, that if you are fully human, you have the capacity of great good and great nastiness. That if we're going to present African Americans as being fully human, robust, embodied beings who are beautiful, who are wonderful, we've got to demonstrate that they have a full range of capacities. And so Harlem Renaissance writers begin to show the underbelly of black life, right? They show black life in a way that is complex, that is thick. And part of what they do is raise questions concerning Christian commitment within these communities. Nella Larson, one of my favorite writers, there's a wonderful short novel, Quicksand. And in the context of this text, the main character, Helga Crane, kind of moves through life, one, being objectified, rendered the exotic, and fighting against this depiction of herself, trying to gain something of herself. And what she will decide on early on is something along the lines of what Linda Brent decides, that if I cannot capture all of life for myself, I can determine who gets me and when they get me, right? She could determine who she would love, who would have access to her body, and when they would have access to it, right? If nothing else, she could determine that much. So Helga Crane is doing this. She's doing this, and it reaches a point where it's not working for her. She has an existential crisis, and she finds herself in a small church in Harlem, and she surrenders to that experience. She marries this unlikely character, Reverend Green, and she moves south with him, and she's working on this. She's trying to be a part of this church, and the internal politics are just destroying her. She's having babies that are literally killing her. And she reaches a point where the prayers don't work for her. The effort to be a part of this church community isn't working for her, and she comes to a realization. None of this is helping. These prayers aren't helping because there is no God. Just us. Ethics changes for her at this point. That rather than guaranteed outcomes we shall overcome someday, for Helga Crane, ethics revolved around struggle. That there's something of benefit, there's a beauty in struggle despite the outcomes. Struggle in and of itself is a reward. Why do we struggle? Because we can. Without saying it, Nella Larson establishes an icon that is very similar to Sisyphus, yeah? Just rolling that stone and knowing it's coming back down, rolling that stone, knowing it's coming back down. And Albert Camus argues that, look, the victory is in that recognition and a determination to persevere. Helga Crane comes up with something very similar. Thank you, Nella Larson. And then there's Richard Wright, one of my favorite. Nella Larson and Richard Wright, two of my favorite writers. And Richard Wright argues that what we really need in the context of human life, if we're going to make things work, is a secular humanism. He's deeply critical in books like Native Son and Black Boy and The Outsider. He's deeply critical of Christianity's claims. From his perspective, theism gets us nothing but a surrender to the absurdity of life. Yeah, that from his perspective, Christianity, theism, forces us to be okay with human suffering rather than taking a stand and fighting against it. And his argument is guaranteed outcomes don't work. Only theists can operate based upon guaranteed outcomes. But the rest of us have to be content with struggle and to find something rewarding in struggle despite the outcomes. Significant figures, Black folks of letters, who provide a way of thinking about humanistic and atheistic sensibilities while maintaining a deep awareness of racism, sexism, classism. So I've spent a lot of time wrestling with these figures. I'm in conversation with them regularly, and part of the benefit of being in conversation with these folks is to recognize that African Americans constitute a significant, a deeply important dimension of the humanist and atheist movement. Deeply important. We are, in fact, legion. Simply because you've not noticed us doesn't mean we haven't been here and been here all the time. You ought to thank us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's chat. I see you.
Richard Wright, but he died under questionable circumstances. Don't you believe he was killed by the FBI?
I don't know if it was the FBI. He dies in 1960 under questionable circumstances, but Albert Camus dies in 1960 under rather odd circumstances as well. Richard Wright, prior to his death, is a bit disillusioned, not only with the United States, but France. Right? France, from his perspective, is being pressured to treat him poorly. He can't, his family is moving to the UK, moving to London. He can't go. Right? He's telling folks, look, his health is declining. He's hooked up with this really questionable doctor that people don't really get. He's always had troubled personal relationships. Someone that he valued consistently was his agent, but most folks either came or went, right? He and James Baldwin don't get along for very long, right? Because James Baldwin raises questions concerning Richard Wright's approach to literature. James Baldwin says, literature's got to be about more than protest, Richard. Richard Wright said, no, literature at its best is protest. It exposes the crap of the world and makes us confront it without blinking. Yeah, so he's arguing. Folks are out to get him. He's telling acquaintances, look, if I go into the hospital and don't come back out, there was nothing natural about this. Yeah, so we're not quite certain. I don't know who did it, but he was quite clear in his thinking. He had a lot of folks who were not friends who meant him no good.
Thanks for being such an expert. Wow.
Why this happens, we cannot fully know. We just know he dies under odd circumstances and his body is dealt with so quickly, we can't find out how or why.
Guys, if you want to ask questions, come to the microphone up here so we can actually record the questions as well. It's really hard.
Where's the microphone?
Right here.
Ah. If they can't get there, I can always repeat the question.
Oh, that's true. You can
Yeah.
also do that if you guys don't want to walk all the way up here.
Well, my thought is to go a little further in the Black history during the Civil Rights era. There's no denying that the Black church was a pivotal force in the Civil Rights movement. Being an atheist myself, I still will give the Black church credit for the Civil Rights movement. What is your feeling about the Black church and the Civil Rights movement?
It's a more measured response than that. Even Martin Luther King Jr., if you look at his last writings, look at Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, for example. He's rather disillusioned with the Black church, right? That most Black churches were not involved. And the financing for the Civil Rights movement did not come primarily from Black churches, right? They weren't paying the bills. And so he's rather disillusioned with this. If the Black church had really been involved, National Baptist Convention developing, right? The Progressive National Baptist Convention develops because the National Baptist Convention USA, the largest gathering of Black Christians, wanted nothing to do with Martin Luther King Jr. in his version of protest, right? And they make this known to him. He loses a position of authority, and he and some others get together and do their own thing, right? So black churches have had good PR, but the level of involvement is questionable. You've got other folks who are involved, and it seems to me that we also have to give credit to folks like Bayard Rustin, who was pushed aside in the movement because of his sexuality, but also because he wasn't a believer. A. Philip Randolph had a pragmatic relationship to black churches. He paid his dues the same way he paid his union dues. But a deep theological commitment to the black church, no, that's not true. Yeah, it isn't true. Now, and the figure who's able to get white churches and synagogues to rethink their financial relationship to discrimination is another atheist, James Foreman. He argues that as a college student, he lost any use for this idea of God, right? But it's the proclamation he makes at Riverside Church, the Black Manifesto, that gets all sorts of churches and synagogues to rethink their relationship to discrimination. They begin giving money to black members of these churches to help them rethink their relationship to race. Even the liberal Unitarian Universalist Association gives money to black members to rethink the relationship of this organization to race. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't get that done. An atheist, James Foreman, did. But we kind of downplay this, right? There's a kind of hostile takeover, and that any of the good stuff Christians claim, whether it's accurate or not, they claim it. And then they hit us with this. Well, we know what Christians have done to try to make the world better. What have you folks done? Pause, arms crossed. Right? But it's a hostile takeover. They co-opt figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who provides early thinking on this, yeah? That W.E.B. Du Bois gives us a way of thinking about race that has shaped the 20th century and the 21st century, right? Problem of the 20th century is the color line. Double consciousness. It's a theoretical framework that we still use, yeah? He wasn't a believer. But we've allowed them to take him because he wrote on churches. Right? So, yes, some black Christians were involved in the movement, put their bodies on the line. But it isn't a safe assumption to argue that the black church did this. Some black churches were involved. And ministers were involved for rather pragmatic reasons, that these were folks whose economic livelihood was not dependent upon white people. That black churches paid their salaries. So they had a certain type of flexibility. There was also a particular model of leadership within these black churches. Black churches are not democratic, they're oligarchies, right? They're ruled by the few. And so these folks were positioned, were set up to play these sorts of roles. Economically, they didn't have to worry about it. In terms of mindset and structure, they were predisposed to this sort of activity. But non-believers were there as well. This was a diverse effort. It's also important to say that churches begin to decline after the civil rights movement, not just black churches, but churches in the United States begin to decline numerically after the civil rights movement. Context of black churches, this membership begins to swing up again in the 1980s, in large part because you've got black folks who are disillusioned. They played by the rules, right? They did what civil rights outcomes suggest that they should do. They went to the right schools, moved to the right neighborhoods, connected with the right people, and still hit that glass ceiling. But they'd surrendered so much, right? Cultural connections, they'd surrendered. So black middle class begins to move back into these churches, right? Because it provides cultural connections for themselves and their children. It provides social networking opportunities. It provides business networking opportunities. And for many of these folks, theology and the sermon was the price they paid in order to have these more mundane connections. Right? So if I got to listen to the pastor hoop and scream and shout for 30 minutes, I can do that because my kids are going to get this and I'm going to get this. Yeah? So we talk about all the black folks who are still in the church without a rather thick and sophisticated conversation concerning why they're there. Not all of them are believers. But those who aren't believers, we've not given them a safe place to land. right? That we, humanist and atheist organizations, do a really good job of critiquing religion. Hell, these folks know it's not working. They know it. The question becomes, what do you give them as an alternative, right? What do you give them as a safe place to land, community, right? A kind of positive approach to life as opposed to religion is shit, right? What else do you give them? And until our movement gives folks something deep, don't expect them to join you. Why? For what?
So I'm curious, what do you see as the future in the Black community for atheism developing and providing this kind of, all the networking and the beautiful, kind of normal processes that take place, and yet, providing a sense of community? Is there something already happening there that maybe we don't know about?
Well, what's happening in Black communities in terms of humanism and atheism? If you take the Pew Foundation study seriously, the number of African Americans who are nons, right, unaffiliated, has substantially grown over the past 30 years, right? So the numbers are growing. And it seems to me that without some sort of intervention, many of these folks will stay in churches for pragmatic reasons, yeah? Those who don't will populate these small but growing Black humanist and atheist organizations, and larger, predominantly white humanist and organizations, predominantly humanist, white humanist and atheist organizations will continue to wonder why Black folks don't join them.
So how do you merge everybody? Or is there a value?
Well, my thing is this. For the larger organizations, right, and I say this from the inside, I'm a member of the board of directors of the American Humanist Association, right? So I say this from the inside. Question becomes, what's the dominant population willing to give up to have this diversity? Right, so one, it seems, first, we've got to stop thinking about diversity as a problem to solve. Yeah? Stop thinking about it as a problem to solve. Two, do some work. Yeah, do some work. That humanists and atheists brag and boast about their knowledge base. Well, read, learn something about us. Right, learn something about us. Yeah, have that knowledge base. Third, find out what issues matter to us. And I just venture to guess, it extends beyond separation of church and state.
Speaking of which, what white community atheists can do for to bring more color, I'm sorry to say that, in our midst. Sikiva Hutchinson and her organization, Black Skeptics of Los Angeles, and Atheists United are partnered. And last year we raised money for the scholarship for underprivileged LGBT person of color youth. We gave out a few scholarships, and we participate in that very willingly, and we want that group to grow, and we want to give more scholarships. So this year we're going to be doing the same thing. So basically what we're doing for now is we're raising money. That's what we can do for now. Eventually we'll try to do more, but to do that I need participation. We need every single one of us to participate in some way. So, and we already have a connection with Black Skeptics, and we're working on it. Sorry.
Find out what people want. And last thing, it seems to me that whites within the movement have to have a serious conversation concerning soft and hard forms of privilege, right? So that you have a sense of our vantage point with respect to life. I'll give you one example. I used this example yesterday. When I think about getting a new car, I think in terms of, right, I have no choice, but to also think in terms of how will the police view me in this car? Yeah, how will the police view me in this car? I don't know that everybody has to do that, but I think about a new car and I think, okay, how are the police going to understand me in this car? Right? Is this a driving while black car? Or in a restaurant, if you put me too close to the door or the restroom, I don't simply think the place is busy or the person wasn't thinking. For me, the natural fallback thought is, so you're gonna put the black man near the restroom, huh? and put the black man near the restroom. So there are ways in which race colors my perception of life. Right? And from my perspective, until white folks kind of understand and are sensitive to the ways in which race colors life and understand that this perception of race isn't logical, it's irrational, but it's real, and you can't simply dismantle this through reason. Until we reach that point, we're going to have a hard time communicating.
Wouldn't education have a large part to do with, educating, the younger generations just in general, to have them better self-awareness, and just have themselves, fend for themselves and kind of critique in a way, that's good for them? Wouldn't that be a good way of kind of contributing toward that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what becomes important, critical thinking skills and effective communication strategies. If we give people critical thinking skills and effective communication strategies, we can do something. But my attitude is this isn't simply a problem for young folks. They labor in the gardens we've provided, right? So I'm talking about folks closer to my age than the students I deal with, right? Because they labor in the gardens we have provided. But folks my age, there's no excuse, right? And I hear too often, well, I just don't know. That isn't an excuse. Google, right? Go to the library, go to the books. It's easy to find this stuff out, but until we have that kind of sensitivity with respect to what and how, what race is, what gender is, right? What these sorts of things are, class and sexual, until we have a clear sense of what these are and how they inform and influence life, we're going to have a difficult time really appreciating difference, because what we try to do with difference and diversity is create a sameness, right? Again, we understand it as a problem, something to be wiped out as opposed to something to be celebrated. It provides for a kind of creative tension that allows us to be our best. We don't need to try to wipe it out. I don't know who's next, so I'm going to.
Does part of our problem arise from talking about the black community as if it were a single entity, rather than there are all those black people and they're as different as all us whites?
Well, in terms of function, that's how it's functioned in the United States, yeah? That if you know one black person, you know them all, right? So too often I'll get, well, I have a black friend, so I X, Y, and Z, right? That what they know about their black friend trumps everything else, right? This is how it functions in the United States. This is in part a problem, right? So you see one black person on the news and you assume that's how all black folks are. But no one looked at Married with Children, Al Bundy, and said that's how all white men are. Right, but this is part of the problem. There's no complexity. It isn't layered. The assumption is they are all the same. And we ought to be more sophisticated than that, yes? We ought to be more sophisticated than that. Hey.
So there's a growing discourse on raising children as non-believers and, addressing issues of morality and such in secular context. But when you're talking about the non-believer community, as you've noted, it's mostly people who look like me. What do you hope we're telling our children about race?
First thing is, it hasn't been handled well, right? That race has not been handled well. Secondly, we ought to move them away from a colorblind theory of life, right? So if you want to insult me, say, Tony, when I see you, I don't see a black man. Right? Because that removes any accountability and responsibility. Yeah? So it seems to me one of the things that we have to teach children is to recognize and see difference without problematizing it. Right? Without trying to wipe it out. But to see it, appreciate it, and become comfortable with paradox and tension. That we don't really solve anything by not seeing the issue, right? We also have to help young people recognize that we live within the context of a system that demands exceptions to the rule. So the presidency of Barack Obama doesn't mean race no longer matters. He's an exception to the rule. And if you just look at his treatment and what he's been able to accomplish and not accomplish, or look at the reaction by folks like Cornel West, I think the world of Cornel West, but think about his reaction to Obama. The race problem isn't resolved. Or think about the Tea Party. It's not resolved, right? So we've got to think beyond the notion that the exception speaks to a transformed way of life in the United States. This is an exception to the rule. You can't maintain the American dream without exceptions to the rule, right? Because with these exceptions, you can say, if you just work hard, play by the rules, do what you're supposed to do, you too can be successful. When it's more likely that black men will have some sort of relationship with the prison system than the White House.
Oh, I'm going to sound morbid in the same line of my first question. Jim Keith wrote a book, and soon after he died from a knee operation, so if you can believe that. He said that Paul Robeson, actually was given medication that made him try to commit suicide. Everybody loved Paul Robeson. I was raised on his records. And but his son is now suing the CIA for giving him this medication that made him suicidal. And there was one other thing. Oh, now Paul Robeson, they had a play about Paul Robeson, I think at the Amundsen here. And of course, everybody's so happy about that, right? I mean, I didn't go see it, but I read the review in Downtown News. They did not mention this. They never mentioned this. Also, Emma Goldman, on just one other, 2 seconds more. I think she died from free corpse, but in the same newspaper, it's not mentioned. It's sanitized. All of this is sanitized. At what point?
Yeah, I don't know that that's the case with respect to Paul Robeson. I do know that the United States took away his livelihood. That I know. Took away his livelihood. That I know. I don't know about drugs. I don't know anything. I do know that his livelihood was taken away.
That's the most important point anyway. Right?
That's all I know. His livelihood was taken away.
Going back to what you said about what do we offer, and one of the major points is why folks go to church, especially black church, especially why I go to a black church, is music. And that's where you get the ecstatic experience, and the experience really of connection. And I think when you believe in something that is beyond yourself, you're allowing yourself to be a little bit more open and a little bit bigger. And that's an experience that people can't get elsewhere. And so I feel like that's what's missing for me in the atheist community. There's a lack of talking about love. You were talking about it's very critical, and I want to be a part of something, but there's a lack of love, and there's a lack of that connection that you get from music. So I will continue to go to black churches for that, but that's what I'm there for. And I think that would be missing as well, obviously. If you wanted to bring black folks into this community, you have to have some kick-ass music.
We need some.
And I'm not joking.
Voices of Reason is the name of the atheist choir. Join the
What is it?
soulful.
It seems to me that it's often the case that our organizations forget about the emotional dimension of our existence, right? And don't necessarily feed that. Sure.
Dan?
Yeah, you already kind of partially answered this question, but considering the role of Christianity in slavery, I know it worked both ways eventually, but Trump for such a long time. Why, just for that reason? So I wondered why Christianity has such a hold on the black community.
I knew this question was coming. It always comes. It came a little late today, but this question always comes. Here's my response. One, our understanding of what Christianity is and how it functions isn't deep enough. That it isn't deep enough. That Christianity is embraced by enslaved and free Africans for a variety of reasons, many of them pragmatic. right? There were real benefits to claiming this, yeah? So there are layered reasons, and although there are problems with the Christian faith within the context of early black communities, you cannot deny that although it did it in an inadequate fashion, it prompted a demand for dignity and integrity. The slave revolts, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, they were ministers. Why would black folks? Because it functions in a variety of ways. It didn't simply pacify folks, it provided a mechanism for rebellion. This is why. Also, I'd say this, humanists and atheists didn't provide a compelling alternative, because humanists and atheists, like Thomas Jefferson, weren't deeply critical of the system of slavery. So why would enslaved and free Africans embrace this? It was as detrimental to their well-being as the Christian faith. So what was the alternative? What was the alternative? But you know, he's been waiting a long time. That much I recognize, yeah.
Okay, I'm listening to you. I become more and more curious. I have more questions than I could possibly have time for, but I would like to see if maybe, I haven't seen your book yet, I will, but somewhere along the line, I could get a reading list, that satisfied some of my curiosity in terms of the question of Thomas Jefferson, who the guy really was, and all the way down there, including the various black authors you mentioned. And so if there's a reading list that maybe a short one that can be provided, I'd like to get my hands on it maybe.
Well, you can email me. It's my last name, PINN, @rice.edu. Put something in the subject line that identifies this conversation. I don't answer the phone very often, but I'm very good with email and text messages.
Okay. Thank you.
Email, you get a response like this. Don't call, it may be weeks, but email, boom.
Thank you. Sorry, just to continue on the question that he had, beside the point that you mentioned, do you think overall, not just in the black community, but any other community, people who are on the poor side, people who are on the hard part of their life, basically, they just believe more in religion as opposed to people who are more successful and who've done better? I mean, I think when people are not doing well or they have more pain, they look for something extra to give them to ease that pain, if it makes sense. So I think that's one of the reasons why Christianity is such a successful and very popular in the black community, because they're always on the bottom and they're looking for something to justify that pain. Can you see that also that way? Or?
I think there are ways in which Christianity is the opiate of the people, right? I get this. But not all the black people are poor, right? And there are middle class and upper middle class and extremely wealthy African Americans and others who are involved in church. It provides something, right? It provides a sense of community, of belonging, and this is vital for folks. And there are ways in which certain churches make this happen. This is my thing, and it's not the perspective or the opinion of all humanists and atheists, but this is my thing. The real problem here is not religion, it's theism. I make a distinction between the two. Religion is a binding together. It's a system for wrestling with the huge questions of human existence, the who are we, what are we, where are we, why are we. Religion doesn't require a God. Yeah? So I have no problem with religion. I think there are ways in which humanism functions as a religion. My difficulty is with theism, that removes our ability to critique and challenge because it lodges information and lodges ethics in a framework of knowing that we cannot get at. For me, that is the problem. Not religion, theism. This is the problem for me. So I'm not assuming that religion or even theism will go away. I'm not one who believes this is the case. From my perspective, if you look at areas of population growth, you see religion thriving. Look at the Netherlands, okay, I get your point, right? But it's not an area of population growth. So I don't know that these things are going away. So this is my goal, this is my thing. I want to decrease the harm that theism can do. I want to decrease the harm that theism can do. But there's a flip side to that. I want to decrease the harm that humanists and atheists do. right? So the bottom line for me is to make life more productive and as healthy as possible. And that involves taking on theists, take on theists. If it involves taking on non-theists, take on non-theists. But the commitment is to quality of life above all else.
This is my first meeting here. I'm Joe. I'll be back next month.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you for having this meeting at all, and good to meet you again. I haven't exactly shared with any of my family members that I don't believe I'm an atheist, and I'm not known for being a quiet person about my opinions. And this is an area that I've become quite passionate about. I'm not going to be quiet about my take on the Bible. And I have 2 uncles that are ministers and 1 aunt, and my mother is a Christian, and she's in a nursing home because of knee surgeries. And I don't know how much longer she'll be around, but how do I say to these dear people in my life who I love, I don't believe that anymore? I mean, what is the most beautiful, simple, loving, caring way that I can express it? Because I'm really blunt, and I don't know how to do that on my own.
I think the first thing to do is to approach the conversation recognizing what theism means to them, right? To be sensitive and respectful of what it means to them, and disconnect a battle over ideas with love and respect for the person, right? That we can disagree over these ideas, but you still family, your blood, right? So 1, recognize what it means to them and respect that. 2, recognize that you're battling over ideas, but the love is the love. It will always be in place. Yeah? And then, from my perspective, then it's a matter of simply saying what works for you, and that you're not saying this to convert them. You're not proselytizing them. You're just simply saying, for Joe, this is what works. Right? I'm not trying to take this from you, but for Joe, this works. Now, we still family, right? And I think what's real about this, real talk, right, that you may lose some folks. But my attitude is, you take your time. I don't have a right to set the time frame for you in doing this. No one here has the right to set the time frame for you on working this out. Right? You take the time you need to work it out. Yeah? But some folks may not be able to get with you. And I think what becomes important then is kind of demonstrating through your actions that the love is in place and you're still good, right? You just don't think the same stuff they think, but you're still a good person, right? You're still the person they have always loved.
Yeah, the last few years I've become more distant because I don't see things the way that they do anymore. And I'm realizing that more and more. I'm like, no, I'm doing it wrong. I must be doing it wrong because I can't. I don't want the distance.
Part of that is shared experience, though. I found I still like going to Christmas. You know, I still like the gift thing. Participating in the family experience goes a long way in mitigating that sense of alienation you get from your family by not sharing the same beliefs in God.
I think that's exactly right. My mother passed away in 2005, and 2 of my colleagues became friends. They became family, right? And their families brought me in. They're deeply Christian, right? Deeply Christian, and I am not, and they know this. But when we get together for the holiday, Mother Floyd says to me, Jesus loves you, right? I'm praying for you. And that done set me on edge because I know Mother Floyd is simply trying to give me the best she thinks she has to offer, right? For Mother Floyd, that is the best way that she knows to say, Tony, I love you. So I respect that. And she needs me to go to church with her. So I go. For me, it's a matter of entertainment. It's like going to a movie or going to a play. It doesn't have that kind of deep theological, metaphysical meaning, but it's important to my family. So I can sit. I can go and sit. But I think you're right. It's a matter of recognizing where folks are and working with them. I don't think we gain much by beating up on people. I just don't know that that really, at the end of the day, is productive.
Yeah, I'm with you. I've always prided myself on my ability to be a good example and lead others that way. Being cruel to somebody, I don't get much out of it, and they likely get nothing out of it.
Your pace, your timing, your pace.
Yeah, comment. Talking about the community and brotherhood and the connection and all that, which you might have mentioned, tried to say, there's this church, a secular church called Sunday Assembly, which meets once a month down the street here, and they have, whoever spoke over here, the singing, the music, that whole church community, they have that. So that might be something in the future which could extend into the black neighborhoods. All that might be on a community level. On an individual level, I think somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson and the Cosmos to really help people find that deep understanding and connection.
A couple of things. One, I'm doing a bit of research now on Sunday assemblies, and then there are humanist organizations that kind of function as a Sunday community. This is my difficulty, that they've taken the framing, the structure of church. Yeah? They've taken the framing and structure of church. And my attitude is we ought to be doing something that is organic. Right? That's organic, that a structuring of our time together that speaks more clearly to and from our particular worldview. And I'm not quite certain that these humanist communities and Sunday Assembly do that.
It might be transition phase.
Maybe. And I also think in terms of science, I think it's important to kind of recognize the relationship, for example, of African Americans to scientific investigation. We do that first by recognizing that scientists live in cultural worlds, and these cultural worlds impinge and influence. Right? From my perspective, that's really the only way to explain the Tuskegee experiment. Right? So just science doesn't necessarily win the day, right? Because science easily mutates into scientism. And it seems to me we've got to recognize the ways in which science has supported rather nasty opinions, right? So folks will tell me, I'll talk in terms of the pseudosciences of the 19th century, early 20th century, and people will say, well, that wasn't real science, but Louis Agassiz was a scientific superstar, right? Nobody raised questions concerning whether or not his work was scientific, but it was used to justify the inferiority, claims of the inferiority of African Americans, and we are aware of this, right? So it seems to me that this science conversation has to take place in a way that recognizes the racial context of the country.
Okay, have you considered other possible models for atheist organizations? I mean, as templates for atheist organizations, such as trade unions. Trade unions are formed to seek the interests of the people in a certain trade, not just wages, working conditions and life quality. Also, one could view atheist organizations as some organizations that pursue the interest of atheists, freedom from undue religious influence and so on and so forth.
I'm trying to stay in my lane, right? I do a certain type of work, and I leave the structuring of organizations to folks who do that, right? You got to do you, right? So I'm trying to stay in my lane, and my lane doesn't really involve the development of these new structures. My lane involves probing and raising questions, right? Kind of probing and raising questions, providing food for thought. You folks determine the structure. I'm simply saying we ought to be able to do better than simply borrowing structures from organizations we're deeply critical of. That there's got to be something more organic to what we do, in part because we privilege ethics over anything else, right? A kind of empirical understanding of the world, a kind of materially based, embodied understanding of life, and there's got to be ways to structure our time together that is much more sympathetic to that starting point. And I don't know that simply emptying church worship of its theology is sufficient for us. I don't know that those shoes really fit our feet.
But that's my point, that there are other...
Well, and I'm saying, yeah, I'm saying explore them, explore them. But I can't say, yeah, this is the way to go or this is the way to go. Explore them.
How often in meetings like this, we call off the topics and people ask you to solve the world problems because, for example, in this particular setting, we're mostly white and we are semi-aware of our privilege. And having you here actually eliminates that very much for all of us. Now we're all penning down the lists of things to learn and books to read later. How often does it happen, and does it make you feel like you taking on too much sometimes?
It would only make me feel as if I were taking on too much if I took it on, right? But I'm aware of what I do and what I don't do, right? And so again, I have a certain set of skills, yeah? And I'm more than willing to share those skills, but I'm not going to move beyond that, right? I have a certain set of skills, and you have access to those skills. The rest, you have to do.
Well, speaking to that point, in your research, have you found in all the writers you've mentioned, is there an answer to what else do you give them when you're talking about an option for the Black church? Have they spoken on that?
I mean, it seems it has to be tailor-made, right? So I love clothing, so I'll talk in terms of clothing, right? There's a difference between a suit off the rack. You can work to make that fit anyone, yeah? But there's a big difference between that suit off the rack and the bespoke suit, right? Big, big, big difference. And what I'm saying is, in terms of what we offer folks, it needs to be bespoke, right? So what do you give folks? My question is, what's the community of concern? What's the geography? And once you determine that location, the geography, ask folks what they want, what they need. Then meet the need. Right? From my perspective, it's really that simple. Determine the location, determine the geography, determine the community of concern, ask those folks what they need, and give it to them.
I'd just like to say that I think I'm new to this organization as well. And I feel like, oh, she's gone. I feel like part of the issue with atheism is people identify it as a kind of hole, a dark hole. It's like, I am godless. I mean, it's a negative, you know, it's not an emotion, I don't know what it is. And I think that what people are talking about is a way to try to invigorate this concept of atheism and to find a reason to come together and be joyous, which was what I think she was touching on about music. And I think to find a commonality and a way to transcend at the same time as achieve a depth, which is what C.S. Lewis spoke about it as religion, is it's a seeking of depth. So I think all these divergent urges in the human soul need to somehow find a new place, a new setting. And what we're talking about here is creating a larger sense of brotherhood on this earth to create a happier, better, healthier earth. And I think if we can get, Black communities, white communities together to look at that as an issue that needs more deep thinking and it needs a higher level of transcendent thinking, then that, to me, that's something that would bring me out. Because it's working on something, it's working towards something, and it incorporates the sense of joy and possibility, which is kind of what you're talking about. So if we, I'd be happy to talk about making that happen.
Yeah, I have no issue with what you said. It just seems to me all of that has to be tied to a deep awareness of the ways in which race, gender, sexuality, and class function.
So let's get a group together.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we have one more?
Do it. Do it.
Do you have a question? Is it a question? One last question, and then we can discuss it over lunch. All of the other issues and stuff. JJ, go.
Do you get a lot of resistance from within your communities, within Black communities around the country or around the world at all?
I don't get a tremendous amount of resistance from Blacks in the movement, right? And in terms of Black theists, they self-select. Those who are interested in hearing what I have to say will invite me. Those who aren't, don't, right? What I often get from other audiences a kind of pushback, a reaction, right? A kind of listing of all of the good things they do. When I'm not arguing, folks haven't been about the business. I'm saying, you've asked me a question, here's my answer, right? Do with it what you will, but don't just list to me, don't give me a list of all the wonderful things you've done.
Okay, we're gonna have lunch. And you can discuss and ask him questions. Let him eat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.